It's on. Okay, thank you. I'm Barb Carroll. Thank you for letting me talk. As you can tell, I am recovering from a cold and laryngitis. I hope that my voice will hold out for this hour presentation. But if it doesn't, Bill Hollings has been through it with me and can pick up color commentary for a second if I need to take a drink of water. I don't normally sound like this, but hopefully I'm understandable. So this is a kind of a walk through the history of Germantown, but as we said to Jean, not the entire history of Germantown. This will take you from the earliest days of this area up until the 1970s. So I'm going to start in 1710, which is kind of the earliest recorded information about this area. There was a French trapper whose name seems to be lost to history, who brought a 15-year-old up the Mississippi River to the Ohio River to the Tennessee River to the Cumberland River, and landed in the area that is essentially Germantown today. And Charles Charleville, as a very old man, gave a hint to another Frenchman to come to this part of the world. That Frenchman was Timothy de Montbrun. So you may have heard of him. But a couple generations later, in the around 1780, there was George Freeland had one of 8 of the stations that were set up around the area that was to become Nashville. And Freeland Station is right where the Worthen complex is. If you will see it tomorrow from a distance on the walking tour. But Freeland's was one of 8 fortified forts or stations. And there's a historic marker. There's a photo of it. This is probably the best view you'll ever get of that marker because it's in the middle of Rosa Parks Boulevard, not at a stop sign, and everybody's going 50 miles an hour. So, and you can't walk to it. So it notes that in 1781, this is the site of the birth of the first white child born in the settlements. And that was the son of James Robertson. This is Felix Robertson as an elder statesman. Felix was a doctor and a bank president and mayor of Nashville twice. So he was off to a pretty good start. One of the first and I guess kind of most important people to the history of the Germantown neighborhood is a gentleman named David McGavick. And if you know anything about Nashville, you know that the McGavicks are kind of all over the place. And David came to Nashville. He arrived in 1786. He acquired 960 acres north of Nashville from George Freeland, including Freeland Station, so this neighborhood. And that area became known as McGavick Springs. He also acquired a couple. That property he actually acquired in the name of his father, James McGavick, but James didn't come to Nashville. He was staying in Virginia.
640 acres was the size of the land grants.
So you learn stuff even when you get old. I was like, why are all these 640 acres? It's a square mile. So these were big plots of land. So he got a kind of a 1.5 mile sized lot in North Nashville, and he got 2 other lots of 640 acres on the east side of the Cumberland River. So he was kind of the first person staking ground in the Germantown area. Not a German, you might note. This is actually his hand-drawn sketch of plantations along the Cumberland. And you can see there's the Cumberland River. And here's the settlement of Nashville. Here's the the French Lick Creek. This little creek along here is the Sulphur Creek that we'll talk about a little bit later. This is his property line. This southern border right here becomes Jefferson Street. So he owns all of this kind of all the way up to the river. So he staked out a fair amount of property. He built there. He built in 1880 what W.W. Clayton called a palatial residence on the frontier, and it had glass windows. And this, we believe, is a picture of the frame house, but pretty soon afterwards he built an even fancier brick house, and so he was pretty well off. He did pretty well for himself. This is actually a painting in the collection of the state. It's a view of the state capitol from McGavock Springs. So there's the Capitol building in the background on the hill, and in the foreground is the McGavock Spring property. Pretty cool painting. I wish I had gotten a picture of it in color, but I could only find the black and white. David McGavock dies in 1838, and the properties get doled out. He had quite a number of children. The properties got doled out. And two of his sons, Lysander McGavock and D.T. McGavock, inherit the North Nashville property. Lysander's name, I don't know, may be familiar to some of you because his home Midway in the south part of town is part of the country club, the Brentwood Country Club. So that home still exists. But D.T. McGavock, he was certified as a doctor, but apparently he never really practiced medicine. He lived in this family home for the rest of his life, and he was a bit of an entrepreneur. His father had used this property for, grazing and for hunting, but he had a vision, and he established the North Nashville Realty Company. And by 1860, he's starting to carve off pieces of this property for residential sale. So this is a map, an 1860 map of this part of town. This is the remaining part of the D.T. McGavock Reserve property. But you can see that some of this property along here has already been subdivided. Streets have been laid. Property to the east, to the river, has been subdivided. Here's the state capitol, so north from the state capitol. So he's carving out pieces of land and turning this into a speculative real estate property. So the Germans start showing up, and they come to the neighborhood. This is a John Budeke, and he arrives from, there's a lot of instability in the, quote, German area. It wasn't even Germany at the time, but it was a mess. And so they were emigrating, and John Budeke and his wife, Mary Ratterman, arrive in the 1830s, and they first live out on Lebanon Pike, on property that is now the Mount Olivet Cemetery. In fact, he becomes wealthy and I think basically donates that land for the Mount Olivet Cemetery property. He's a really successful merchant. He sells groceries and he sells booze. It turns out that the Germans are big into drinking, which is a pretty profitable enterprise. Around 1840 or 1845, he builds a large house north of Nashville on land that was that he apparently bought from D.T. McGavock. So this is a photo, Civil War era photo of him and his son. This is the Buddecke House, and it was built again around 1840, 1845. This is what is now Monroe Street. This was the beginnings of, at the time, Vine Street, which is now 7th Avenue North. You can see the Capitol area in the background. So the Buddeckes were important members of the community. More Germans were showing up. They their house kind of becomes a hub for the German community, and Germans are moving into this area. This is a picture of that house about 1900, and people are hanging out. They're doing worship services there. There's a kind of a chapel area in the house for their German Catholic community. This is the Buddecke House. It still stands. If you go on the walking tour tomorrow, you will see it. In fact, you're going to start at it. So Bill can tell you more about the Buddecke House. So other notable Germans are kind of moving into the neighborhood. One notable member was Adolphus Hyman, who built a lot of the first round of really impressive buildings in Nashville. As an architect, he was a stonemason. He also owned a fair amount of property, including the horticultural garden that I'll mention later. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the buildings that he built are lost. They were lost. The one that I know still stands, and others of you may know more than I do, is the building down by the Howard School building that looks like a castle that had the Children's Museum in it.
Lindsay Hall.
Is that Lindsay Hall? Anyway, that building, if you know that building, it's a fabulous looking building. I went there and took classes as a little kid, and I thought it was the coolest, most castle-y building I had ever seen. It was great. Another prominent German was a guy named George Wessel, or if you're really German, George Wessel. He was a baker and a confectioner, and apparently he was known for his wedding cakes, including these magnificent, all over the South, people ordered these magnificent 10-tiered wedding cakes from the Wessel bakery. Then there was a guy you probably have never heard of called George Dickel. He started out in the boot and shoe manufacturing business, but he was also pretty easily converted to the distribution of liquor, and so this is the George Dickel of liquor fame. And then there was a guy named Henry Neuhoff, and he was a very successful butcher and merchant, and this is a picture of Henry and his wife and his two sons and seven daughters. Is that right, Bill? 5 daughters, 2 sons and 5 daughters, 7 kids altogether. And I'm turning to Bill for this because Bill lives in what was Henry Neuhoff's home on 6th Avenue North, High Street. And if you go on the walking tour, Bill will tell you more than you ever wanted to know about the Neuhoffs. But you might know the name because the Neuhoff packing plant, which is on the west side of the Cumberland River, is being converted. The remains of it are being converted into a pretty impressive complex that's going to be multi-use. And I'll encourage you to see it at some point. Back to the liquor. Germans brought their beer brewing expertise with them, and there were a number of breweries, including the Cumberland Brewery and the City Brewery and the Rock City Brewery. And this brewery, which is the Nashville Brewing Company, this is on the corner of Jefferson Street and between either third and fourth or fourth and fifth. I think it's fourth and fifth. But there was an even fancier one, or an even bigger one, called the Gerst Brewing Company, going up in south of town. And they were both named the Nashville Brewing Company, so they tended to call this one the North Nashville Brewing Company and that one the South Nashville Brewing Company. I don't know if you were ever at the Gerst House, but Gerst was a very successful brewer. Unfortunately, his plant was not in Germantown, but I give him some credit for beer in Nashville. So they were drinking, pretty early and often. Whoops, let me see if I can go back here. This is a page from the city directory from 1869. Is that what it says, Bill? I don't remember. And here's John Buddicky, whose photo at home you saw earlier. And it says groceries. He's big on groceries. But underneath it says liquors of all sorts. So they were not ashamed. They were pretty happy with their distribution of sales. This little area here says wines and liquors, and listed here is George Dickel, and listed somewhat lower is G.H. Ratterman. I mentioned the Ratterman name earlier. Mary Ratterman was married to John Buddicky. But this is her brother, George Ratterman. And George Ratterman comes up in the next little section of the presentation. So this is the home of George Henry Ratterman. You can tell he was successful because in 1859 he was listed in the city directory as a clerk, and by 1897 he's listed in the city directory as a capitalist. I'm like, I guess that was a good thing in 1897. He was a friend of Andrew Jackson. He was quite successful in business. He married a woman named Eleanor Callahan. She has a bit of her own history. She traveled with William Walker, the gray-eyed man of destiny, who went tried to conquer Mexico and ended up he started in Mexico. It wasn't very successful there, so he went to Nicaragua and was very briefly self-declared president of Nicaragua. And she was along for the whole ride, along with members of her family. She was an acolyte, if not a consort. We can't quite establish that. But anyway, she got over that, moved back to Nashville, and married George Ratterman. This is the Ratterman house. He built it along with a house next door around 1860. It still stands. It's on the walking tour. Bill can talk a little bit more about that very colorful history tomorrow in the walking tour. Ratterman also built some more modest properties, and these are right up the street, a few lots down from his mansion. This is now, it currently stands, it's known as Ratterman Row. He built them as workers' cottages for new immigrants coming over. We don't know if he did that out of the goodness of his heart or whether, he was providing for cheap labor for his property. But these also still stand and are part of the walking tour tomorrow. There were other notable families in addition to the German Catholics and German Methodists. There was a fairly substantial Jewish community, or Jewish members of the community in Germantown, mostly German Jews, including a guy named Gustavius Schiff, who's fairly well known. He was the first Jewish member of the National Medical Society, the first Jewish member of the Nashville Board of Education. And there were also Jewish merchants, Kaplan, Cohen, Foreman, Glick. There were Italians, there were Swiss, there were Polish immigrants, Irish immigrants. This guy, John Broderick, was a fine Irishman. He started out as the driver of a mule-drawn streetcar. He became a policeman. He had run-ins with the chief of police. So he was fairly notorious. He was in the newspaper a lot. Ended up being a fairly well-noted builder of bridges and sewers for the city. I know about John Broderick because I live in his house, which was built, his part of it was built in the 1880s. It's on the walking tour tomorrow. So Bill can tell you about that tomorrow. Let's see. So it was kind of, Germantown quickly kind of became a pretty hopping area, and it established a horticultural garden, and it was fairly extensive. It was like 17 or 18 acres. It later, after the Horticultural Society had it, it became owned by Leightonberger. Leightonberger was one of the brewers. It became a beer garden, so people would go there, hang out, drink their beer, and get water from the sulfur spring. This is a photo of the sulfur spring in that little latticed structure in the beer garden. Part of this property, this horticultural garden property, still survives. The city got 3 acres of it for what is now Morgan Park in the North Nashville area, in the Germantown area. Another really interesting. So down here is the park area. It says City Park, which is interesting because it's 1877, and we didn't think the city owned it until later. But up here is, you might notice this little oval shape. Here's the Cumberland River. It says the Nashville Blood Horse Association. This was the racetrack in the city, and it was very fancy. And all the ladies and gentlemen went and watched horse races and raced their thoroughbreds. Belmead horses raced here. One of the big problems was, though, it was in a kind of low-lying area, and it tended to flood, and the ladies didn't like it because it got their gown, their hems dirty with mud. So, but it was at the time the site of the richest horse race in the world, the Peyton Stakes in 1843. The purse was $35,000. That's big money in 1838. So, where this is now is kind of, I think, underneath what is now the interstate. So,
For context, where the lake shows up, that's now Amulet Lake in Metro Center.
no, I don't think so, Bill. I think this is farther south than that because here's the river. I don't know. We'll figure it out.
There's a lake down there somewhere.
It may have just all been, because I think this is the stream that goes to
Yeah, you're right. That's
yeah.
far south.
That's the sulfur spring.
Oh, that's the part of Morgan Park.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the block between.
Yep, that's exactly where it is. So let's talk about Church of the Assumption. It was pretty important. So here's the Buddecke house that I showed you, and the Buddeckes and other German Catholics decided they wanted to build a church, and D.T. McGavick, not a Catholic, but an entrepreneur, sold Buddecke and his cohort property for $5 to build a church. But his condition was that they had to get it built within 18 months. And you kind of wonder, why was he so anxious to get this Catholic church built? He wasn't German, he wasn't Catholic. Well, he was an entrepreneur, as I mentioned earlier, and he figured that, if he gets a big old church built there, that he's going to sell a lot more of these lots that he's divided. So this is a view about 1870 from The off screen here would be the cotton mill, which I'll show you later. This little roof line here is, we believe, the McGavick home, and this is what was Vine Street, now 7th Avenue North. They got the church up in 18 months. I think they even beat the odds. It was dedicated in 1859. So how successful was McGavick in getting these lots sold? Well, this is the 1897 Sanborn map. Here's the Church of the Assumption. Here's the Butteke Mansion. Everything's built out. This is Jefferson Street. So he was very successful in selling his lots. For those of you that know Sanborn maps, you'll know that the pink buildings are brick and the yellow buildings are frame. I learned that. I didn't know that. But since the Sanborn Company was a fire insurance company, they cared which ones were made out of frame.
Incidentally, the Sanborn maps are available in the National Archives, and they haven't been until recently.
They are. And Bill, you want to talk about yours?
Yeah, I was going to mention the frame one there is a Sanborn map from about 1910.
Is that microphone on?
Is what?
Is the mic on? I can't.
Oh, I turned
Stand up and turn around and just shout out, Bill.
on the bottom.
The frame map is a Sanborn map from about 1910.
It's okay, it's okay.
Shows the same whole area from the Cumberland River, and that really gives you an idea of how built up it was in another 10 years.
So here's a picture of Assumption. They've added their pretty impressive steeple by 1909. I will say that this was commandeered, the church was commandeered to during the Civil War for use as a Union hospital. I'm not going to talk about the Civil War because there are people in the room that are way more competent to talk about the Civil War and its impact than I am. Only to say that, of course, this area was impacted by the Civil War. But the church survived. It stands today. It was actually pretty heavily damaged during the 2020 tornado. They had to replace the roof and the steeple, and they're doing a whole lot of work on the interior. And I don't know whether you're going to get a peek in there tomorrow into the interior or not, Bill. No, but it's still an anchor for the community today. So by 1865, the Civil War is ending. This part of North Nashville, which was kind of at one point considered a distant suburb out of town, is now incorporated into the Nashville city limits as the 9th ward of the city. And the 9th ward was referred to as North Nashville, but it was also referred to as both Germantown and Butchertown. This is a quote from 1870 where it says, extending northward is Germantown or North Nashville, occupied by beautiful suburban residences and in part by numerous manufactories, surrounded by the habitations of industrious and contented artisans. The vicinity of Germantown is especially noted for its number of handsome cottages and villas. So you can tell that they're building handsome cottages and villas. So there's a real mix of residences, and there are manufacturing operations by these skilled merchants that are living in the neighborhood. Yeah, so this is the cotton mill that I mentioned earlier. It was established right after the Civil War. It was started by Samuel Morgan as the Tennessee Manufacturing Company in 1869. Morgan was also the builder for the state capitol. Superintendent for the state capitol. And he's buried in the state capitol. And Morgan Park, that I referenced earlier, is actually named after him. Didn't become Worth & Bag until the late 1920s. This is a postcard from 1875, and here you can see the building. Here in the corner is still standing the home of the palatial home of D.T. McGavick. And I guess these folks in front are the contented artisans, I don't know, in the neighborhood. Let's say that's what they are. This is an image also of the cotton mill circa 1883. And Bill will point out, he'll point down the street. We're not going to walk down to the cotton mill, the Worthen bag factory tomorrow, but it's huge. It's pretty hard to miss. It was the largest cotton mill in the South, I think, at the time it was built. So there are a couple of other notable buildings in the neighborhood that I wanted to mention. This is the original Eliot School. It was started as the 9th Ward School around 1873. And the citizens, including the German, the Buddekes and Rattermans, paid to have a really fancy bell and clock put up on it. It served as it was the first public school in this North Nashville. This building served until 1916, when it was replaced by the current Eliot School, which has stood from 1916 to the present day. We found an article from 1916 that says the bell and the clock was dismantled and placed into the safekeeping of the city's property. So we're going to ask for it back. I know it was an article from 1916, but I'm sure Nashville has kept good track of the bell and the clock from the original Eliot School. This Bill will talk about on the tour tomorrow. It's now it served as a school until the early 1970s, and served as offices. It was closed for a long time. It has now been converted to upscale condominium apartments. This is the Monroe Street Methodist Church, which was an offshoot of the original sort of small German church on 6th Avenue. This building was dedicated in 1906. This image is from the 1960s. It's on the tour tomorrow as well. I mentioned that Germantown was known not just as Germantown, but as Butchertown. And that's because there were a lot of German butchers in the neighborhood, including the Baltz brothers. That name may be familiar to those of you who have a long Nashville history. The Jacobs, the Neuhoffs, Leitenberger. They started out, the Petrys, they started out butchering and smoking in their backyards. And they had carts, and they sold from their carts. And because Germantown was pretty close to downtown, they could walk or take their mule carts to the public market and sell their smoked meats. This is an image of Charles Petrie, one of the merchants, with his cart and his horse. It's after, I know it's after 1904 because it says he's on 4th Avenue North, and the original names of the streets didn't change it to number names until 1904. This is an image of the last smokehouse standing in Germantown. It's off an alley between 5th and 6th in the 1300 block. This photo is from about 1980. When did we lose it, Bill? When did it go down?
Probably shortly after
Yeah,
that.
in the early 80s, but it was still there. So they were smoking in these little smokehouses in their yards, these German merchants.
Coronado Fake Stone needed more parking.
Yeah, and they're long gone too.
Yeah, they're gone.
So here's the thing with the butchers who were butchering in their backyards. As they became more successful, it started to actually become a problem for the neighborhood. And the historic guidelines for the neighborhood state it pretty well, which is by 1915, changes took place that would bring about the neighborhood's decline. There was refrigeration was being developed. The small butchering businesses were being phased out, and larger slaughtering and meat packing houses, they needed more because they were being successful. They were being developed. They were concentrated along the west bank of the Cumberland River. And this is the kind of the crucial quote here, which is, they infringed upon the pleasant residential atmosphere of the neighborhood, which meant they stunk to high heaven. And I know that firsthand because the rendering plant was still in operation when I moved into Germantown in the 1980s. And when the wind blew in the wrong direction, it usually blows, toward the east bank, which was fine. But when it blew the wrong way, it was awful. It was awful if you've ever smelled a rendering
But the
plant.
city's
Sewer treatment plant was also there, and that didn't help because it was an open treatment plant as well. So
Some of
Wasn't
us
there
could tell the
also
difference.
fish?
there were fish markets and fish manufacturers. So there was some pretty nasty stuff kind of developing in the neighborhood. Oops, I'm sorry, let me go back. So this is just an image of the Cumberland River. These are some of the packing plants that were being developed along the river. This is a lumber yard that was being developed along the river. So there's kind of growing industrial use. This is 1897. There's this growing larger industrial. They're going from being small artisan craftsmen to being industrialists and, I don't know, capitalists. This property is where that Newhoff facility is today. Another thing that was happening was that streetcars, Nashville was pretty aggressive in putting in streetcars. They were originally mule drawn. They were electrified by the 1880s. And one of the first, in fact, I think the first streetcars ran from the public square up College Street, which is 3rd Avenue North, into the Germantown area, to Jefferson Street, and then kind of north again to St. Cecilia. So, the growth of the streetcar lines allowed people to move farther away, basically. They didn't have to live within walking distance of the public market. And so what starts to happen is a little unfortunate. The merchants that became very successful by the Germans in North Nashville, they grow their businesses to these big operations, and then they're building in this area between North Nashville and the downtown market square. They're putting in processing plants and refrigerated warehouses, and they begin to crowd out the residential properties. And so downtown real estate speculation jumps, the real estate gets really expensive, poor people are crowded into slums, and that's Hell's Half Acre on the north side of the state capitol, which you may know about. And the people that had grown wealthy in Germantown by their manufacturing, they move out of town. They can afford to leave. They build these palatial locations midway. And Renraw, if any of you know anything about the history of East Nashville, this palace by the Warner family, Renrow is Warner spelled backwards, just so you know, out on Gallatin Pike. So the rich people are leaving. The poor people are getting crowded into slums. The neighborhood stinks. It's not going well for this beautiful little neighborhood. And, so for a long time, it had been really cool to be German in Germantown. They were really, the Germans wanted to maintain their language. They wanted to maintain their cultural identity, their connections to the fatherland. That's what they called it, not me. They had German language press. They had German language social organizations, trade associations, and the churches in the neighborhood were German language churches. This is Barth German Methodist Church. It stood in the neighborhood on 4th Avenue until 1971, when it burned. They had their own bank, and that bank survived and went through a lot of changes, including becoming Commerce Union Bank and then Wachovia Bank and now Wells Fargo Bank or something. But it was cool to be German in Germantown. But then things started to go sideways for Germans in America because there was the Great War, and Germans were on the wrong side of that. The ones that had maintained strong connections to Germany, were feeling a little awkward, maybe. There was a lot of hysteria. They didn't want to be perceived as the enemy, so they laid low. They started moving away from this concentrated Germantown area. In the press, there were, I love this third bullet, there were exaggerated cases of emotion, including suggestions that citizens kill their dachshunds.
Recent news.
Yeah. Yeah, no kidding. Small world. In the box here is an interesting quote from Wilbur Creighton, which says in 1917, the city reservoir was closed to visitors because the paper had been filled with stories of German atrocities, including the use of poisonous gases and deliberate infection of water supplies.
Sidebar issue on that, in doing the research, one of the reasons for the newspaper coverage was
Needs to
Luke
use his
Lee
microphone.
owned Tennessee, and he was very much opposed to the Stallmans who owned the Nashville Banner. Stallman, of course, was German. So Luke Lee filled the Tennessean with anti-German stories, hoping to drive the Banner out of business.
That's why Stallman became so ultra pro-America, pro-South.
Exactly. The Germans spent a lot of times proving what great Americans they were
His
in
family
town.
were carpetbaggers,
Yeah.
Republicans.
So then the Great War ends, but the Great Depression begins. Nobody's doing well during the Depression. The Depression was a little late to arrive to Nashville, but it arrived, and nobody was doing well. And then straight into World War II, where the enemies were, the Germans. And so this was not a good time for the Germans in the neighborhood. There were many who had remained in Germantown that got out of Dodge. They just left town because they didn't want to be, perceived as this concentrated German community. But one of the worst things that happened to Germantown was in the 1950s, the concept of pyramidal zoning was put in place by the city. This was considered a really innovative approach because it dedicated zoning, it was the first zoning, and it dedicated the highest part of the pyramid was considered residential zoning, then kind of commercial and retail on the next tier, and then industrial and manufacturing, and then farmland and that kind of stuff. So the most exclusive neighborhoods were zoned as residential. So Belmead, for example, pretty residential. But Germantown suffered because Germantown wasn't exclusively residential. And so it couldn't be zoned as residential. And there were industrial properties in the neighborhood. And so it got zoned industrial in the 1950s. And at that point, these beautiful villas and residential properties were like, well, we're done for. We can't, what's the point? All the rich people had moved out. Renters had moved in. The owners of these properties let the properties kind of fall to disrepair because they were doomed. They were going to be torn down and repurposed for industrial purposes. So what had been the most exclusive suburb in Nashville is set for ruin. This is a picture from the 1950s of the 1200 block of Fifth Avenue North. It's not looking real good.
None of those buildings are there now.
No, they're all gone. This is kind of what it looked like, these little warehouse and industrial operations. This is a photo from 1979. This is this quote from the historic guidelines for the neighborhood. Really kind of talk about it. Houses began to be torn down or extensively altered. They became rooming houses. There was a lot of deferred maintenance. It depressed the property values, absentee ownership, as a direct result of this industrial zoning. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water here.
Sidebar, the building on the corner has now been replaced with a development that's commercial on the ground floor and residential 2 stories above that.
Including the depressed property values in the 1960s, this building was built as Section 8 housing, which is low-income housing. It didn't help the neighborhood, frankly. This picture's from about 1979. This house, which was one of the lovely residences, was torn down in the mid-century, and put a missionary Baptist church was put up in its place. There are some people that have called that an important mid-century modern building. It was actually hideous and stuck out like a sore thumb. The good news is this house next to it survived. It's in this picture, and it'll be on the walking tour tomorrow. So,
And the church will be too.
the church, which is no longer a church, will be commented on probably not very favorably.
And
But
now looks even worse than that picture.
yeah. So, all of this is urban renewal. All of this is happening on Capitol Hill. The Hell's Half Acre is being cleared. The Centennial Park is being envisioned. James Robertson Parkway. This whole area is considered to be prime for industrial development. So Germantown is basically doomed. And this image, this is a picture from about 1969, and I just want to kind of point out. So down here is the farmer's market. This is Jefferson Street. This is an H.G. Hill grocery store. This is the Elliott School. Here, this is a line of homes, and they're already starting to be torn down. This was a palatial area. It's now a vacant lot. This is the Section 8 housing that's been put into place. All of these homes up to, I think, right here. This is the first existing building. All of this was lost. So gorgeous homes, Victorian homes, gone, lost to history. But it's this is a photo. Bill found this photo of property in Germantown. This is a condemned building being sold by the street frontage, footage. The buildings themselves deemed to have zero value, just the land value.
And that street frontage included the 5
Here,
Radman Row houses.
Here, Bill.
I can't hear him.
Just hold this one close to you.
That 380 foot included the 5 Radman Row houses, a vacant lot, and 2 two-story Victorian houses. And that property, along with what's now the Germantown Inn, sold for under $100,000.
Yeah. So, that's the end of Germantown. A sad end of Germantown. Or, there's another session.
Oh,
And then the next session, if we can figure out a time to do it, will be about saving and reviving Germantown, brought back from, this really, really sad place. So we'll take some questions. Yeah.
When was the St. Cecilia mother house, established in North Nashville?
It was late 1800s, but I don't know the exact year. Bill, do you know?
It was before
Oh,
the
it's,
Civil
oh,
War.
oh, that's right, it was.
I think probably the 1850s.
1850s, they barely survived the Civil War.
There you go.
Yeah, I think it stayed open because I think it was the only school that stayed open in Nashville during the Civil War.
And of course, now the interstate separates St. Cecilia from
Germantown.
Germantown.
Yeah.
But I guess there used to be a lot more connectivity.
Well, the German community was kind of sprawled all over. So, like Adolphus Hyman, who I mentioned, didn't technically live in what is now the borders of Germantown. He lived in the at 9th and Jefferson, which is technically Buena Vista, and the Salem town area, which is designated. It was all Germans all through that area, all the way up to St. Cecilia. Yeah.
There was recently on American Experience, PBS, a show called Nazi Town about pro-German, pro-Hitler activity, boons and so forth in German neighborhoods in the 1930s. And Rachel Maddow also wrote a book about that. I just wondered if you ran across anything about that in Nashville.
You know, we didn't. The Germans that we know about in this area didn't seem to put forward a real pro-German, pro-fatherland, pro-Nazi face. In fact, it was sort of the opposite of that. It was, we're the, best of all the Americans, and we're really all in on America. And they really subsumed their German culture and heritage pretty quickly, and promoted their very Americanness. So, not as far as we could tell, there really wasn't a lot. Nobody poisoned the reservoir. Yeah,
What was the movie theater on 4th Avenue North around Monroe?
the peacock,
Foul.
the peafowl,
P-FAL.
the peafowl.
And that mosaic floor can still be seen.
Still there.
Still there. We're not. That's a little outside of our
That's
walking
on
tour, but if you're walking tomorrow and you're still enthusiastic, you can see that.
Where is it?
It's on 4th, where the Little Hat Market.
Madison.
4th and Madison.
It's in a building?
Yeah,
Two-story building.
yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Not to get off topic, but were there other major areas where Germans moved to in Nashville?
I wouldn't say. I mean, Germans moved to Nashville. There was a fairly big concentration. At one point, almost 20% of the Nashville population had German background. So it was fairly populous, and there were Germans in South Nashville, and there were Germans in other parts of town.
So St. Henry's Church is named
For Henry Newhoff.
Because he gave them the land and
Yeah.
money. The Germantown Hill up in Joelton was an area of German settlement. They had vineyards up there. When the Catholic Church was about to give up on Assumption Church, they established St. Pius X across the river in an area I think maybe members of the Baltz family donated. So there were Germans in that area. The Baltz farm out on White's Creek Pike just sold, sadly, for an enormous amount of money. So the Germans, some of them were into farming, and the Newhoffs had a place up in White's Creek, higher than that. But a lot of them were out in that direction and up in the Joelton area. And then, of course, the prosperous ones were in Oak Hill, Belle Meade, places you would expect to find them, which is one of the reasons for St. Henry's being where it is.
Any other questions? Yeah.
The transportation of the cattle and hogs to the meat packing,
Yeah.
is that railroad run through there?
It was largely the river, and then there were tracks. Yeah.
There actually, some did come in by the river. Some were actually just driven up in herds on the streets, which I'm sure was lovely. But there actually is sort of still an extensive railroad network down there. It's very little used, and most of the rights of way are basically grown up. But CSX owns most of them, and they, I understand, are still very reluctant to part with even so much as a
some of the developments down there.
Well, the Nashville Stockyards on First Avenue, right on the river.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I guess, did the Butchertown, folks trade through the Nashville Union Stockyard?
Almost certainly, yes.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
Can you comment on the history of the Stockyard Restaurant and the future of the Stockyard Restaurant?
I cannot. That is outside the limits of the current Germantown neighborhood, and I did not research it at all, although the building itself still stands and it has its mixed use at this point.
I will say just a bit of clarification on that. If you're in the real estate business, Germantown is anything from downtown to TSU to the river to Metro Center.
If you're trying to sell real estate in that part of town.
The historic district is actually about 13 blocks between Jefferson, Rosa Parks, Morgan Park, and the river.
Well, let's have a
Thank you.
hand for them. This has been wonderful.